Yo, it's your boy Ancient Albatross here again with the Cypher Unlimited crew. We have our usual suspects of AD or Alpha Dean. We have Spigs18 or Anthony. And just as a quick reminder, if you haven't already, be sure to follow us here on Twitch or subscribe to us over on YouTube. It is a great help to our channel. Don't know why the bot didn't send the link, but I will get that out there. But yeah, as usual, Dean, what are we doing here tonight?
Well, it's going to be a good night, man. You know, we're transitioning into a new year. The next time we see you guys, it'll be just before the new year. And, you know, Christmas is right around the corner. So happy holidays, folks. But tonight we're going to talk about GM intrusions. This thing that pops up every now and again. You know, we're going to go over the ins and outs. You know, is it railroading or is it not? You know, and just basically the power of an intrusion and how to view it, that type deal. You know, we're going to go through a lot. But, you know, without further ado, I'm going to just smack that ball over to Anthony and let him get us going.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the CU. Happy holidays for all those that celebrate. And like Dean said, today we're going to talk all things about GM intrusions. So let's try to tackle that question of, could GM intrusions be perceived as some kind of GM railroading? So we have like this long list, right, of like show ideas, and this was an idea we pulled up because this idea actually comes up a lot on either in our Discord, Reddit, and it usually comes from people that do not necessarily have a lot of experience with Cypher System. So we thought this was a good topic to post as a poll on our YouTube channel. We posted it last week, and we had 114 people vote on this. 2% said yes, they think it's railroading. 89%, the majority said no, they don't believe it's railroading. 7% said they did not know whether or not it was railroading or not. And 3% said maybe. So once again, thank you to everyone that took the time to vote on this topic, and a special thank you to everyone who posted their opinions in the comment section. And we will read all those opinions tonight because I think there's some jewels and some great statements that should spark discussion. So let's first start off like we do with all our topic videos by reading the official rules. So for the official GM intrusion rules on the CSR, they page 408 in the physical book, of 410 in the PDF, and that's the Cypher System revised book. So Al, can you do us the honors and read the official GM intrusion rules?
Sure, I can do that. Let me just pull it up here. Oh my god, it's so bright. But yeah, the book defines GM intrusion as such. GM intrusion. A GM intrusion is the main mechanic that the GM uses to inject drama and additional excitement into the game. It is also a handy tool for resolving issues that affect the PCs but do not involve them. GM intrusion is a way to facilitate what goes on in the world outside of the characters. Can the Minotaur track the PC's movements through the maze? Will the fraying rope hold? Since the players roll all the dice, GM intrusion is used to determine if and when something happens. For example, if the PCs are fighting a noble's guards, and you, the GM, know that there are more guards nearby, you don't need to roll dice to determine if the other guards hear the scuffle and intervene, unless you want to. You just decide when it should be best for the story, which is probably when it would be worse for the characters. In a way, GM replaces the GM's die rolling. The mechanic is also one of the main ways that GMs award experience points to the PCs. This means that you use experience points as a narrative tool. Whenever it seems appropriate, you can introduce complications into the game that affect the specific player, but when you do so, you give that player 1 XP. The player can refuse the intrusion, but doing so costs them 1 XP. So by refusing an intrusion, the player does not get the experience point that the GM is offering, and they lose one that they already have. This kind of refusal is likely to happen very rarely in your game, if ever. And obviously, a player can't refuse an intrusion if they have no XP to spend. Here's how a GM intrusion might work in play. Say the PCs find a hidden console with some buttons. They learn the right order in which to press the buttons, and a section of the floor disappears. As the GM, you don't ask the player specifically where their characters are standing. Instead, you give a player 1 XP and say, unfortunately, you're standing directly over this new hole in the floor. If the player wanted, they could refuse the XP, spend one of their own, and say, I leap aside to safety. Most likely, though, they'll make the defense roll that you call for and let it play out. There are two ways for the GM to handle this kind of intrusion. You could say, you're standing in the wrong place, so make a roll. It's a speed defense roll, of course. Alternatively, you could say, you're standing in the wrong place and the floor opens under your feet and you fall down into darkness. In the first example, the PC has a chance to save themselves. In the second example, they don't. Both are viable options. The distinction is based on any number of factors, including the situation, the characters involved, and the needs of the story. This might seem arbitrary or even capricious, but you're the master of what the intrusion can and can't do. RPG mechanics need consistency so players can make intelligent decisions based on how they understand the world to work, but they'll never base their decisions on GM intrusions. They don't know when intrusions will happen or what form they will take. GM intrusions are the unpredictable and strange twists of fate that affect a person's life every day. When player modifications such as skill, effort, and so on determine that success is automatic, the GM can use GM intrusion to negate the automatic success. The player must roll for the action at its original difficulty level or target number 20, whichever is lower. In section 25, you'll see a whole list of examples of intrusions to use as a base, as well as advice on using GM intrusions as a narrative tool, using GM intrusions as a resolution mechanic, using and not abusing intrusions, group intrusions, intrusions through player roles, and of course, player intrusions. Yes, quite a lot.
What a mouthful.
Yeah, that is a mouthful. And you see it goes really in depth. Essentially, we'll start it off with this. You know, there's two methods of giving it out an intrusion. One is when a player essentially rolls a critical, and you get to change the narrative that way. And then the other one is by offering, when you, as a GM, you want to add something to the narrative. You offer the player or players, if it's a group intrusion, a resource, a XP, in order to make this change to the narrative. And of course, players have an option of canceling out. So what is the first question we should ask ourselves and the group, right, is how important do you think intrusions are to the Cypher system? I think let's tackle it from this angle first, because I think it's it makes a lot of sense for us to start there.
Well, if we're going to start there, then I'm going to tell you that I think the GM intrusion is as integral to the Cypher system as the concept of the Cypher itself. I think it goes hand in hand with the conceptualization of it being a cinematic storytelling, and I think it also is a tool that allows us as GMs to become better at basically arbitrating those situations, you know, in game. Whereas if you think about when we come from other games and you play D&D, it's a critical failure, and that's what you're thinking. You're thinking failure, you're thinking mechanics, you're thinking, you know, how am I going to screw the players? Where I think GM intrusions shift your mindset. They allow you to start looking at it through a cinematic and storytelling lens. So yes, it could be something detrimental, or could it be something that's going to amp up the tension in that particular situation? And I think that GM intrusions, by using them, the more we use them as GMs, the better we get at actually facilitating to the story versus worrying about mechanics. That's me.
You see, I think it's important. Jack One Spade brought up a great point that made me think about something that I'm about to say, but I'll read his statement first. I'll read their statement first. I'm sorry if I use the wrong pronouns, but I've run games where I almost never use them because I feel weird. Gamifying story events or encounters, I forget about awarding them, even though I'm still having surprising events occur. I agree with that sentiment, but I'll slightly push back and say that since Cypher System doesn't have as many mechanics that push the story forward from the GM perspective, or just rules of the Cypher system as a whole, that this is a way to affect the narrative mechanically for the GM without feeling like the jerk, because you're actually offering the player something. If that makes any sense. Because Cypher doesn't have much mechanics to begin with. It's essentially 4 or 5 mechanics that control the entire game, if you really think about it. But it has these broad mechanics that cover a lot of, it covers a lot of instances. These broad strokes that cover a lot of instances, and I think GM Intrusions is like the glue that holds it together.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think it's a juxtaposition between the two, the two thought processes. Like what Jack Spade said, he said he feels weird gamifying story events, but overall, like you said, Anthony, built into.
I agree with him. I think when I first started playing, I felt the same way entirely. Like, well,
I don't think I ever felt that I was gamifying. I don't know. I think the GM Intrusion was probably the easiest mechanic for me to embrace, because I never liked, the critical fumble ideology. I knew something should happen if you roll a 1, just like something great happened when you roll a 20. But the whole negative connotation of rolling a 1 was always a thing. And then, since Cypher has taken
from the negative perspective, and Jack could correct me if I'm wrong. From what I gathered, and I felt like, is this worthy of an intrusion? Like, is this something that I should be using as an intrusion, or is this just something a GM should be doing to change the narrative, or add something spicy to the situation?
Well, and I understand I understand that, and see, that's what I'm saying though. I think the way intrusions work is that it does allow you to start thinking in terms of story and how you could reward your players for the twists and turns you want to put into your story, versus, always worrying about a die or a mechanic built into the game that's going to cause that thing to happen, a die roll. That's what I'm saying is, that's what I'm saying. The intrusion was the easiest mechanic for me to kind of wrap my brain around, versus some of the other things that Cypher did. And I mean, and again, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, because even using intrusions as, candy for the players, I agree. It was a new thing to me too, and I would forget initially until I got to the point where I'm like, listen, I need to give at least 1 intrusion per player per session, and then I started introducing it. Then I got the idea, let's do a group intrusion, give everybody an XP, but then versus, where the ones came into play, what do I do now? Where it turned me from going, you break your sword, to giving a cool cinematic moment,
Let's double back a little to the initial, again.
No, just before it gets lost, because the chat is popping tonight. I want to mention what Eric said a few lines back, which is a great point, and I feel like it needs to be said before it gets missed, which is basically kind of what Dean was saying, but just kind of more succinct. It is one of the best tools to help new GMs feel comfortable learning the process of storytelling and finding impactful moments. I've honestly never thought of it in that regard, but that is such an excellent way to phrase it. It'll help you as a GM learn those moments. Gamifying kind of helps you out in a way, because you're rewarding the players. You're again finding those great moments in the story. And yeah, it helps with pacing, because you're setting the pace of the story with this GM Intrusions. And that's awesome.
To jump on that, I think that not only are GM Intrusions a fantastic tool for you to keep the story moving forward, but it also lets you control the pace at a pace that you're comfortable as a GM. If you need to slow things down, you can use the intrusion mechanic as well. So it's like the perfect pacing tool, and I think it'll help a GM going back to a more crunchy system to see how pacing actually really works once you GM Cypher System a couple of times. Because Cypher System gives you these pacing tools. The GM Intrusion is a perfect mechanic that helps you with pacing, and it'll help you running different games. And I know a lot of people in chat mentioned a bunch of other systems, you know, like Fate or Powered by the Apocalypse games that also have narrative elements. You know, I think when you play those games and then you go back to crunchy systems, it actually helps you. You know, even if Cypher isn't your, you know, go-to system.
But I do agree with you there too, that, you know, my experience with Cypher has enhanced my ability to handle other games, both as a player and as a GM, you know, because I have a new appreciation as a player. And I just want to, you know, Al's right, the chat is like going crazy. I want to come. Eric made a statement, and so did old Gus. Well, he's +9 here, but they both made great statements, and I just want to highlight both of their statements. Old Gus said, "Players get XP because they earn it. You gave it to them as the GM, and you have unlimited XP to give. So allowing players to spend what you agree they earned is a nice lesson to a GM to unclench your backside and let players narrate something." And then you intrude it to let them know the universe that they are in. So I think that's really great. You give the players some narrative control because they get to intrude, we get to intrude, so on and so forth. But again, you still let them know that they're still bound by the rules of the world. That's awesome. Eric went on to say, for veterans and practice GMs, this lets the GM paces the growth of players without trying to build encounters through XP. It also becomes a resource for building and buying for the PCs, which again is another awesome tool, which I think is what I was trying to get to, is that it allows you to let the story be told, and you're not trying to come up with like 42 encounters to make sure they get enough XP to get to the next level and so on and so forth. You can do it through the story itself. So those things I think are.
So we're going to ask the question that was the question of the night. Do you see GM intrusions as railroading? And if you do or if you don't, why do you think some people perceive it to be railroading?
Al, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. With this, I would say there's a yes and a no. It can be, but most of the time it's not. It really depends on how the GM is using it. But what it really boils down to is when a GM intrusion does happen, even if it is somewhat railroading, the players, like Dean had pointed out with the past two comments, the players gain the ability to change the narrative themselves going forward with the XP they earn. They can do player intrusions now. And again, if the GM is railroading them, he might be kind of strict on those player intrusions, but the fact remains that they have access to it. So again, they might be getting railroaded in a way, but they still have that power. They're given that power to change the narrative themselves with the mechanics, which again, railroading, but you can still kind of give them their hand in the narrative. So yeah.
And you want me to go next, or you got something? What you want to say?
I always have stuff to.
I know you do.
I'm gonna say that GM intrusions can be railroading. It depends on the GM. By definition, they're not meant to be railroading. But I think there's two types of people that view GM intrusions as railroading. One, to me, is the person that has very little experience with Cypher System or very little experience with narrative games, with the concept of the players and the GMs going back and forth, sharing the narrative. And the other person that I think would consider intrusions railroading is the person that had a bad experience with a GM who was actually using it to freaking railroad. If that makes any sense. Because I think that it can, in the wrong hands, I can absolutely see it being railroady. And I'll give you an example of a bad
Real quick, Anthony, you took the words out of my mouth because I was going to say it is a nightmare in the wrong hands, but continue.
I'll give you an example of a bad intrusion. A bad intrusion would be the player spent a half a session trying to create this cool object that might throw a monkey wrench in the GM's plans for the future, right? Like, say they create an artifact that's going to let them bypass the GM's big bad, right? And the GM would use an intrusion to get rid of that device, right? That would be an example of a bad intrusion, where the player spent a lot of time and effort and enjoyment in creating this device. And since it's instead of the GM figuring out a workaround with the device in the narrative, they'll just choose to remove it. Oh, the device doesn't work. The device is broken. Blah, blah, blah. Intrusion. You know what I mean? That would be an example of a bad intrusion. And I've seen that happen. So I don't know if I'm guilty of it, but I might have, well, you know, everyone makes mistakes. I could have been guilty at one time of doing that, but I can recognize that that's not the proper use for an intrusion, if that makes any sense.
Well, no, it does. It makes absolute sense, and that's what I'm saying. You know, this is why I asked you guys to, you know, give your opinions, because and I think we're all on the same, you know, accord when we say that it can be a railroad. It can be a nightmare for, you know, the players if the GM isn't experienced, if the GM doesn't like I said, I think we have to embrace the idea that the intrusions should not always, they shouldn't be something mechanical. They should be, you know, in a lot of cases, in most cases, it should be something that is indicative to the story, that's going to cause the narrative to shift in some way, or cause some sort of, you know, intensity within the player characters, you know. And like, you know, Eric was saying that it's kind of a dance between the players with player intrusions being introduced. It's a dance between the GM and the players. And it really is, you know, even though the players have a more limited scope in what their intrusions can do, it's still one of those cool aspects. You know, you think about it, an example like in the same example that Anthony used, you know, they came up with this device that could bypass the big bad. Well, the GM makes it not work, right? But then the player could go, well, guess what? Here's my intrusion, and I got this one piece, and I'm going to jury rig it for one last ditch shot. You know, but I mean, that's a player intrusion than a GM intrusion. But I don't think the GM should ever use that. The device does not work anyway. I think that's. I know that. I'm not saying he should. I wasn't saying that. I was just using that as an example. I was piggybacking on your example of how it could become a dance, and it really shouldn't, not in that respect. You know what I'm saying? It shouldn't become, I'm trying to negate what the players are doing versus what the players negating what I'm doing. We want to add an interesting complication to the storyline. You know, perhaps, you know, if I was going to add in, like,
do you view intrusions as a complication?
Yes.
I don't.
I view it as a complication to the narrative.
As a yeah, I view intrusions as a change in the narrative, and I think that's I think it's a change. I think it's a big but a complication for a change is you know. I'm not saying it's wrong for viewing it that way. I'm just saying I think there's a huge divide on the server on how people view it, because I can always get pushed back when I say, oh, I don't think it's inherently negative. Like, I never view, and when I hear complication, and maybe that's just the way my mind thinks, but when I hear complication, I think that it has to be inherently negative. And to me,
and I don't think, you know, that, for example, a prime example to me, okay, I'm chasing, you know, I've used this intrusion, you're chasing a bad guy, and I had to use it one time, and the player rolled a 1. And instead of me making it like totally screwed up, what happened was the player had to make the choice of keeping the child from being injured. The child wasn't going to be murdered or die, but they would be injured or he would lose and he would lose time in his pursuit. You know, where he could have had him the next round. Well, now it's going to take it longer. So those are the type of things that I like to do with intrusions. Those are what I'm saying about it, switching the idea of it just being totally bad. That's just me though. That's how I like to use it.
Yeah, I love what Brilliant Loser said. It's just a beat change. Yeah, that's how. I mean, he said it better than I could have said it. That's essentially how I. It's just a narrative beat change.
Yeah, no, it works too. I agree.
I always find it funny, especially at con games, where I would say something like it'll be something really bad happening, right? Like, I mean, terrible. Like, two people are down, someone's down to the, just the points on the speed pool, like 2 points, and then I'll say, hey, you want an intrusion? And everyone will look at each other and they'll be like, yes? Like, something terrible is gonna happen, and I'll add some reinforcements or give them a cipher or something to to once again to keep the story moving forward. Like the GM intrusion mechanic is the whiteout of gaming in the Cypher system. So and it's funny to see their reactions when they get something positive out of an intrusion. I always think that's hilarious.
Well, Eric probably put it the best, and maybe me just saying complication was the wrong thing. Eric said GMI has categories in my mind. Complications, NPCs show up, scene change, monster power, major NPC become more powerful, dangerous item. So yeah, beat changes. I guess that's probably the best thing we could all say, because it's all encompassing. I agree with you. And it can change the narrative in that way, but I also believe it can be a complication. I also believe all the things that Eric threw in there, because I've done it. I've done like probably every one of those intrusions, so it's pretty damn cool that we can sit here and have this discussion and be able to even expand upon our ability to present this to someone else. And that's another thing. That's another good thing about this discussion.
Since I gave an example of a bad intrusion, could you give me an example of a good one?
My favorite intrusion. I talk about it all the time.
No, that's not that one. He hasn't said anything. I was trying to get Al in the combo.
No, man. I love this example of his, though. It's a great example. Let him tell that story, because it's a good one. I really like this one.
Like, my favorite intrusion that I've done was, like I said, we had a guy running around in the game. He was the best swordsman in the land. And he was crushing it. He was crushing it session after session. Like, and probably maybe 5 sessions in, he finally rolled that faithful one. They were fighting against the city guard. He swings his sword and rolls a 1. The guard catches the blade of the sword in his hand and smiles at him and goes, "You're not as good as you think you are." So for the rest of that scene, he was hindered against the guard. You didn't break your sword, you didn't lose it. And then what it was cool about it was that guard, that captain of the guard, ended up forming his own band and became a group of NPCs that, were rivals to the party. It was really fun. It was cool. And it was like mind blowing, because when I thought about it, I was like, okay, yeah, I got to do my Princess Bride moment, because remember, I have a secret. I'm not left-handed either. Those things. It's like, so that's the kind of stuff for me, what it was.
One of the reasons why that's a great example for intrusion is because not only did it affect the scene, it affected the entire campaign, even though you may not have known that when you gave that intrusion, but in the long run, that one intrusion affected the entire session and sessions after, which is a great example of why that would be a perfectly placed intrusion.
I had no plans for it. It was a spur of the moment thing. It was a spur of the moment inspiration. I had no plans, and you're absolutely right. And that's why I kind of embraced the whole concept of intrusions and doing them, that they're narratively based,
Yeah, chat is really jumping, guys. There's a lot of great things happening. Ken Hub, I think you've used this joke before, Ken Hub, but it's still mad funny. He wrote, "See you bingo card." Al smiling and quietly moderating. Ant and Dean, what the chat is moving so far. Ant and Dean interrupted each other and like bickering. Dean doing the old man story, remember when? and we hit any other squares. Me saying a curse word out of nowhere. Yeah, that's pretty much our show in a nutshell. We need to hire Ken Hupp as our producer because he got our script down pat.
But actually, funny enough, that wasn't the story I was thinking of when you mentioned a good GMI. A good example of a short-term GMI that Dean, usually tells the story, which is what I was expecting actually. We were playing a Supers game, and I was like a Ghost Rider type character, and I could summon a car, and I just kept summoning a car from height and dropping it on the BBEG. It was a big robot, and it was strong, so I was like, why not? Just keep doing it. And, this is the beauty of a GMI. Dean saw this and was like, oh wait, this is kind of messing up my fun, or messing up the fun. So he had it. I dropped the car on it once, and then it shattered into I think it was 4 or 5 little bots that actually composed the big one, and then it turned into a little group fight instead of the one big bad. And that was a very fun GMI because there's no way I was not gonna accept the GMI after I'm just dropping cars. Why not? Yeah.
And again, I did not have that plan. That wasn't in my toolkit initially, but I was like, what the hell am I gonna do? Because this is gonna be a boring battle. It's not gonna be, And when Al accepted the intrusion, it was like, perfect, let's do it. I had to go into my repertoire of remembering what's happening in comics.
Another example of why that's just to steer back into the intrusion thing, example of why that's a good intrusion is because one, Dean had his big bag annihilated, right? Instead of being the jerk, like how we were using in a bad intrusion example, he let you get the enjoyment of doing the cool thing to destroy the big bad, but he also kept the story moving forward. So it wasn't only you getting to attack the big bad, the whole party could be, because he gave us an intrusion to allow us to continue the combat. So that's another great example of using an intrusion in the correct manner, allowing everyone to be involved and still allowing you to have your spotlight because you still remember doing that cool thing. So it's almost like in an MMO fight, he allowed you to take stage 1 of the fight, and now he'll allow everyone else to jump into the next part.
Good example, man.
But your guys mentioned some stuff that I think is good mentioning. We talk about intrusions that players are having control, but how about those intrusions where you roll a 1? Do your guys normally make 1s negative?
Normally, yes, because they're 1s. But
inherently, I do it too from the D&D days. You can't.
I have had positive things happen from 1s. There is still that complication, but something positive is also happens. Like, for example, I forget what game it was, but I just chose the simple, natural 1 thing. You slip and fall, right? Oh, you fell. But on top of that, I was like, oh, but as you were getting back up, you found this on the floor, and I gave him a Cypher, and that was part of the GM intrusion. So, there's ways to play with it, even with a 1.
Maybe the old school groundhog in me, a part of GMing is realizing your deficiencies, and I think when I see a player roll 1, in my mind, I still have that 30 years of gaming where a 1 means something freaking bad. You know what I mean? And it's a habit that I have to break. But
like I said, like I said, that's why I went with the complication, because I'll put a negative twist on it. Even with the one I use with the guy when he rolled 1 and, you're not as good as you think you are. For the rest of that scene, the PC was hindered against that guy, so he was 1 difficulty level tougher. So there was a negative built in, and I do my best to try to build a negative in that isn't completely detrimental, but again, kind of adds a flavor, so that's kind of what I try to do. It was hard, and trust me, I was with you. I can honestly say, and I was drawn on that 40 years of, oh yeah, we're gonna break your sword, you're gonna kill your buddy next to you, you're gonna stab some, and I had to break that habit. And intrusions, the ideas of them helped me break that habit.
I'm gonna ask another question because I know that this one comes up all the time when a player rolls a 1 and re-rolls, I know your guys' answer, but I'm asking it for YouTube and for Twitch and for the chat. When a player rolls a 1 and spends the XP to re-roll, do you still keep the GMI?
I do.
I know you do.
I think I used to not, and then after we discussed doing it, I started doing it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is, I started doing it because Dean did it to me in the game, and then I was like, "Yo, this is actually really cool." I got this from Dean. No, it isn't in the rules, Eric. I think that's actually a house rule.
Yeah, it's not in the rules. They say if they spend an XP, they can cancel the intrusion.
Yeah.
Then, well, no, the rules actually say when you can spend an XP to re-roll that failure. It doesn't say the intrusion is canceled, nor does it say it isn't. I just took it as it isn't. That's the way I took it. And I've run with the ball.
It is until I started playing with you. Dean corrupted me, and now I do it the way Dean does it. I think I just think it's more interesting that way. It's also challenging. It's challenging yourself to come up with a GMI that's still successful, but still has a change in the narrative.
Well,
As a GM, anytime you can challenge yourself in the narrative, that's fun.
And I'm gonna tell you where it actually came from. The reason why I did it was also reading the Cypher System rulebook and reading horror mode. When horror mode said you could conceivably still succeed at the task, but still activate a GMI. There is no offer to give a XP to cancel those intrusions during horror mode. So I'm like, this makes perfect sense. And that's where it came from, because I just extrapolated from there. I'm like, well, that does make sense. Yeah, you can succeed at the task, but that doesn't mean you didn't somehow cause this intrusion. So that's why I do that.
Naruto asked a really good question.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, that's what you're pointing out.
Yeah, no, I was pointing because of that. I was literally on my screen pointing at it. You guys can't see it, but I'm pointing at it. But either way, he asks, or they ask, how do you decide what is just the scenario or consequences for player actions versus what should be an intrusion? And was the answers to this was mentioned by a bunch of people earlier on, and it really boils down to, I think Jesus had said it best, a beat change. It changes kind of what's going on in the scene in a somewhat dramatic fashion. You can have, like you would see in stories like, let's say Star Trek or whatever, right? They're having their little like talks on the deck or whatever, and then suddenly they're attacked by some third party, right? That would be a GM intrusion. Whereas everything happening within the first conversation that's happening on the deck, that would be a bunch of different other roles, player consequence, etc. part of the story. And then we have this dramatic change happening. That would be a GM intrusion. Yeah.
Eric brought up a great one too. I really, you know what?
Dean, you want to finish answering that question before you move on?
Oh yeah. Okay. So what Al was saying, and I agree. For me, I do it in stages, because again, thinking of horror mode, I think of the game in stages. So if it's early in the game, early in the session, the intrusions will be very simplistic. They won't be major things. It'll be just like when you're watching a movie, and let's say you're watching a James Bond movie and it's early in the movie, and it's that scene where he's trying to find out some information, and he accidentally trips a switch, and then there's a camera that comes on and watches him. So I'll do that intrusion early on, the simple one that's not super impactful, but it'll have impact later. But as the game progresses, so do the intensity of my intrusions. They become more harrowing. They become more impactful in the sense that the players will be able to respond. It'll have, pertinent action right there in that moment, versus having to wait down the line to see what happens. So that's kind of how I deal with that.
I mean, when Naruto was asking, how do you tell if it's just a scenario or a consequence for the player's actions? that was a perfect way of phrasing it, because to me an intrusion is something that changes what would be the player's actions in that scene. You got to view Cypher System like how Dean was saying, in the form of scenes. So if a player would traditionally would be doing, the players would be doing a specific action in that scene in your mind, anything you do that changes the scene to force them to either do different actions or modify the current actions that they're doing is a good spot for an intrusion. If you view it from the lens of a movie and doing it through scenes, you'll see it's a lot easier to see. And I could give you like a visual example is the players are all running down the hallway trying to get to a door before it's being locked. They're chasing someone, and before being locked, they're currently in that scene. They're concentrating on everyone is running, trying to stop this door from being locked. Right? Your GM intrusion could be that there's a sirens going off from behind them, and they hear clicking noises coming through the vents up top. So now they could either continue running to stop this door from being locked, or turn around and investigate the sounds that they heard. So now they have actions to create actions within the scene that they traditionally wouldn't have if you didn't add the intrusion into the scene. I don't know if I explained it right, but that was my thoughts.
It sounds good though.
But yeah,
I want to bring up what Eric brought up. Eric actually, and Eric, I'm stealing this. I like the idea. I never even thought about doing it, but that's awesome. Eric said, I use horror mode in so many games. I also have a heroic mode where crits increase 20, 19, 18, 17, and it keeps increasing each round and treating 16 and 19 as if it were 20 for big moments. So I could see activating heroic mode in like a superhero game. Just think that the final fight between Thanos, Captain America, Thor, that was definitely heroic mode. That was, you could see that, that battle. Cap was rolling 18s and 19s and 50s, but he was getting it in.
We could definitely do a heroic mode. I think that was worthy of its own show.
But that's like, I like that, Eric. I really do. I never thought about doing it. Thank you very much. That is definitely put into the mental Rolodex and the toolkit.
Other people in chat were asking, which was one of the questions in our notes, right? Is how many intrusions do you add per session? I know we've had this discussion before, but what's your when you plan out your session? Do you plan intrusions, the amount of intrusions you run beforehand, or do you plan the actual intrusions that you want to use in your session?
Like I said from the beginning, I'm always the one. I try to have at least one intrusion per player per session and one group intrusion. That's my go-to.
Do you plan the intrusions beforehand? You know how like the book gives you example intrusions? Do you tend to do that?
No, I don't, because I don't know what the situation is going to be. I kind of let the players. I feed off the players. I feed off of what they're doing in the narrative. Again, that old adage, be careful what you say at the table, because what you say, whether you're playing in character or out of character, becomes fodder for the GM to use against you. That's just the way I see it. So
I follow the one per player, one group per session if I can. But I will say this, I don't necessarily pre-plan intrusions, but I do think of a fail-safe intrusion in my mind. And what I mean by that is if the game is going completely off the rails and I have to get the players back into a specific scene that I need to keep the story moving forward, I usually think of in case of emergency, break glass intrusion. And I might not jot it down, but I think about it.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's a
I
good
will
idea.
say this. I must be hella lucky because I've never even considered doing something like that, having something like that at the ready. So I guess I've never had my players go that off the rails before where I've had to think of that contingency plan. But yeah, I'm in the same ballpark as you guys, one each and then one group one if possible. I will say though, again, I don't plan any of them. It's just whatever seems right in the moment. And I will also say that just like some people have said in chat, I forget a lot. So sometimes it's just like one or two intrusions a session, period. That's on me for not running as often as I should, so it gets forgotten about. But I will say that I do try to keep it in mind for moments where it does create a memorable moment or something changes dramatically within the scene. And if I'm forgetting them, I at least try to make sure I have something like that in there somewhere. It's like, oh shit, I haven't been doing it. Let me try to throw it in there.
And I'll say this about pre-planning intrusions too, Anthony. I think if I'm running if I were to run a campaign and I knew I was gonna have the same players every single week or however often we played, I might start pre-planning intrusions, personalized intrusions because based on their story arcs and things like that for things to happen. But most of the time I'm running one shots or 3 or 4 parter games, so I don't necessarily have the time because there's not the investment there for me to pre-plan my intrusions out. I have to kind of be I had to become very versed in thinking on the fly to get something to work in the moment, because players are unpredictable. So
But there is a reason why most adventures, the Cypher System adventures you purchase, have the intrusion examples.
yeah,
Because I think that it's actually helpful to put examples of intrusions when you're prepping. If you choose to do writing prep, and believe it or not, when I read a pre-written adventure for Cypher System, I like reading those intrusion examples. Whether I use them or not, it puts it in my mind. Hey, this scene might need an intrusion. You know what I mean? So even if I'm not using that intrusion, it's telling me that you might need to use an intrusion in this particular scene, which is very helpful.
I mean, I agree that the intrusions in the book are great. In any pre-written adventure are great because they also inspire other intrusions for me because they allow you to see the tonal quality of the narrative that you're in the midst of, and it also gives you an idea of what the writer, what the author of that adventure, what they're thinking or what their thought process was in the mode of the game itself. So yeah, I think that's something about Cypher System that we have to kind of I think get people to wrap their brain around, is that it is all about the story beats. It's the cinematic storytelling, it's the narrative. And I think that's what
Okay, dude, I'm sorry.
no, I was just saying, I just think that's what GMIs are kind of about, are the narrative itself. So go ahead.
I will say this though. I'll mention that sometimes he forgets. That's okay too. I've had great sessions where I've had like one group intrusion and maybe one, because I think this is another mistake people make, right? And it kind of goes back to that initial question that we were asked. If it's not adding anything into the narrative, you shouldn't be throwing intrusions in for the sake of, hey, Dean hasn't gotten into this intrusion in the session, let me give Dean because then it weakens and it sullies what an intrusion should be. It makes it like less important because Dean just got an intrusion because I needed to give him an XP for some reason. Or he's down to XP. So you shouldn't. In the perfect world, you want to have one intrusion per session, but if the narrative is moving at the pace that you want as a GM, the story's flowing the way you want, and there's no opportune time to actually put in intrusion where it actually fits, it actually changes the scene, then you shouldn't put it in.
Yeah.
What I was going to piggyback on that with is, even though again I might forget to do GMIs, whatever have you, and again it's mostly for that reason that Anthony stated. I wait for the like a natural feeling moment to do it. I don't like to shoehorn it in. So if it comes down to one or two a session, then so be it. But the flip side of that is I don't think this is in the rules anywhere. I could be wrong. I also award XP to players for doing cool stuff in the narrative, or discovering something cool within the story or something. It's not all from GMIs, so the players are still not suffering from that XP deficit from not receiving the GMIs, because if they're actively playing and playing the story well, and there's no narrative like good narrative moment for me to insert the GMI, I can just be like, oh, that was very cool of you, or that was very funny, whatever, here's an XP. Yeah, just as a flip side note.
I like to bring up too. The last game I ran on the server, I did a adaptation of The Fog for Halloween, and old Gus was in the game, and I remember playing, and I was allowing the players to inject themselves into the world and kind of control certain aspects of the narrative, and old Gus just put himself in a perfect position for me to do a GMI. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying, like what Al was saying, Anthony saying, that we're saying, where it just made sense. His character went out running, had headphones on, and he was contemplating, his family's trash. He had just had a little bit of an argument with his father. And it was just a perfect place to inject this little piece of tension. It wasn't a negative, it just was a narrative beat that, he got this vision, of the monsters in the fog, and the truth behind what his family had done in the town. It was great. But it was a perfect moment. I didn't have that planned. I didn't know, that I was even going to be able to, expand upon that point in the story at the time of sitting down to write it out and put this together. But it was just one of those situations, like you guys were saying, players are going to if you pay attention to your players, they're going to give you the opportunities to give them good intrusions. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and mess around with it, because it's like any other skill in GMing. When you use an intrusion and finding the right time to use an intrusion in your session is all through trial and error. You're going to mess sometimes up where it's not going to be as impactful as you want to. But trust me, when you put an intrusion in the right part of a scene, everyone feels it. You feel it as a GM, the person that the intrusion is happening to feels it, and everyone at the table feels the shift in the narrative. They feel like, oh, I was thinking about this. Oh shit, I gotta start thinking about this, because that was a perfectly placed intrusion.
And and Anthony, that is absolutely right, and I think the biggest thing for any new GMs out there, or people new to Cypher System, don't stress about using your intrusions. If anything, if you have to try to remember, maybe give yourself a spot where you have put tick marks, and okay, I got 4 tick marks. Okay, I need to try to put it in. I need to try, but I don't have to. And if it doesn't fit, it just doesn't fit.
I've been guilty of that. 100%. Like when I first started running Cypher System, in my mind, I was like, everyone has to get an intrusion. Everyone's going to get an intrusion. I'm going to do a group intrusion. And I used to literally check it off. Like, Al, check. Dean, check. And then I stopped worrying about that. And more worrying about how impactful is this intrusion going to be into the scene. And once I started thinking that way, my intrusions became way better.
And I'll say this too to everybody out there. When you start looking at Cypher through that narrative cinematic lens, or better yet, start watching television and look at places in TV or movies or wherever that you can see, oh wow, that was a GM intrusion. Because the flow of the narrative in the story that you were watching shifted. And you literally got to see that shift. You got to see that impact, and that's where I've been learning. I sit back and I watch, they got me watching crazy anime, the how to pick up girls in a dungeon, or is it wrong to pick up girls in a dungeon? That show has like tons of great GMIs that are impactful, but not negative. It's just really cool to be able to start seeing those things, and by seeing them, now you can start using them yourself.
Before we go into the question, I mean, all the responses that we got from our poll, the last question I'm gonna ask us is, what's your overall opinion on intrusions?
I love them.
Thumbs up.
I honestly love them, and I wish, and I find ways to use them in other games. Other games that don't have GM intrusions. I just find ways to slip them in there, and give players a benefit. Because like in D&D, I've given characters advantage, to slip something in on them. I don't phrase it like we do with Cypher, but it's the same concept.
Al?
Yeah, it's thumbs up. It's definitely a great tool to be used, as long as you're not abusing it. Like maybe if used well, it's a great mechanic. It definitely has room for abuse, but I don't think I've ever actually seen it be abused, quite honestly. And I'm not one to play as many games as my colleagues or the general community, but I actually have not seen many GMs actively abuse the GM mechanic. So yeah, overall, very positive experience I've had with it so far, and it's definitely made me a much better GM as a whole, I think. Now, after reading Cypher System, I think I can go to any system and run it well. And GM intrusions are kind of a big part of that. They kind of open my mind to how, again, those beats in the story and when they should change and all. You become more attuned to that sort of thing, and it becomes less about the system and more about the story. And yeah, it was a huge change mentally.
I mean, for me, I view it in, it's the whiteout of GMing in the Cypher System. It allows you to correct mistakes that you may have made in the narrative. And more importantly, it's there to make up for the fact that they don't have a mechanical rule for every instance in an adventure like other games would. I think that the GM intrusion mechanic is there to allow you to explain why stuff happens in the story without having to have a rule for it. And I think that when you have a rules light system, like Cypher System, like Fate, you need those mechanics that allows the GM to shift the narrative, because there isn't a physical mechanical rule for those instances. So the GM intrusion says, it works like this is happening, I don't need a rule for it because here's 1 XP, this is why this is happening. In other systems, you can't necessarily do that because there's rules for every minutia of a story beat. But since Cypher doesn't have that, the GM intrusion mechanic is the catch-all cover for all of it.
Yeah, and I like I said, I agree with that. I agree with that 1,000%. I mean, it just to me makes sense. And again, that's why I said I think by having this, my favorite term, my paradigm shift with Cypher System, I think it's just made me a better GM overall for whatever I decide to play or run. Because I can take so many of the lessons that I've learned with me. I can put those in my toolbox and pull them out as necessary. So,
that's another bingo box. D mentioned paradigm.
Yeah. Zeus Legion says there's a series of action plays where the GM kept trying to help a PC that refused to budge from their hidey hole until they burned through all their XP. This was because they inherently expected the GMIs to be negative and had just escaped a traumatic event. This is why I think GMIs should offer options, but not be inherently negative. And I'll say this to that respect. Cypher System is one of those things that, in general, if you are getting players who've come from other games, other things that are, rough situations or whatever the case may be, depending on how ingrained they are with it or with those other systems, it can be a chore to get them through it. Whereas I've noticed people who have never RPG, played an RPG in their life, I sit them down with a Cypher game, and it's like a duck to water. They're there. They're in the moment. They're having a blast. And I've, on the other side of the coin, games that have more mechanically heavy and so on and so forth, i.e. D&D, people don't take to it as easy. It's a particular mindset, I think, overall. So that's just my 2 cents.
Blast 52. Well, I'm not running session yet, but hope to in the next few weeks. First off, awesome, congratulations for a few friends. But I am worried that when I use a GMI, the players who are closer to each other will always grant each other the extra XP that comes with it. So those players will always be ahead of XP. You know what's a simple way of doing that from people giving themselves the same XP? When you say who you're gonna give the XP to, and they keep on saying the same name, say why. Have them give you an explanation why that person deserves the XP. I promise you, if you start saying that, they're gonna think about the narrative and give it to the person that's actually either involved in the story or just did something cool recently.
And I can also tell you that a lot of times I've experienced that a lot of times that XP literally gets kind of shifted around the board. People, especially if you explain to people, and I had to do it. I didn't want to do it, but I did it. I started splitting my XP pools. Any XP you earn during the game from intrusions, so on and so forth, are used in game. And what I give you at the end of the session is used for character advancement. So I had to do that, but and it kind of eased that trigger where now the XP is being spread across the board, so other people in the game can help with the rest of the narrative as well. Because if only 2 people got XP, then you're still going to be giving XP away. Because if you want them to succeed, because you can give people XP.
Sidetrack, but that happens a lot at cons. When you have 2 people that know each other and 3 people that know each other, and they tend to give each other XP, and they specifically asking for GMI XP.
Yep.
Like, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of another video type, but if you just ask them why, you force them to think about it.
Yeah.
All right, let's start reading the questions, the quotes that people posted on the YouTube. Zeus Legion, a great follower and a great supporter of the channel, wrote, "Depends on the GM. If they're always hostile rather than in service of the story the players are creating, sure. Done right, they offer the option of an unexpected dramatic shift that can be negated with XP, unless you roll a 1, which is a 5% chance." That was answering, do you think GM Intrusions are railroading? And that's a great point.
And then we had Kangster. He said, my take on GM Intrusion. That's what I said, Kangster.
No, I said they said. What do you?
Oh, they said, yeah. My take on GM Intrusion as a GM is it does not need to hinder the players. From the book quote, GM Intrusion is the main mechanic that the GM uses to inject drama and additional excitement into the game. It is also a handy tool for resolving issues that affect the PCs but do not involve them. GM Intrusions always is a way to facilitate what goes on behind the outside of the characters. And I take this as GM Intrusions can be something that benefits the players if the world reacts that way. Maybe some players choose to save a session before or earlier in the session and decide to help the players in more direct ways. Maybe a family member or a friend of a player was nearby and gave them a piece of information that the player couldn't find themselves due to some unforeseen events in the game. Exactly. I mean, I think that, oh, wow, it was just more. I'm sorry. He said also in the book itself, it literally says, quote, a GM says, quote, a GM can use this narrative tool to steer things. That doesn't mean railroad the players or direct the actions of the game with heavy hand GM intrusions. Doesn't enable you to say, you're all captured, so here's 1 XP instead. The GM can direct things more subtly and gently, almost imperceptibly, influencing events rather than forcing them. GM intrusions represent things going wrong, the bad guy planning well, fortune not favoring the characters. If we take GM intrusions as railroading, then we have a more fundamental problem, since the whole story is DM railroading the players. If we look at it that way, after all the clues, what information is available, and where and how to obtain all in the DM's hand to begin with a pre-made adventure and more. So with a pre-made adventure, since it's just slightly moves the GM's hand and the rest together with the author's hand.
I mean, those are all great points. The only thing I will say is that I don't think that most GMs do it on purpose. I think a lot of times you get the railroaded GMIs by accident, but I agree with pretty much everything that this person said. I mean, and if you are doing it on purpose, I probably wouldn't play with you past that one session if I felt that way. You know?
Right. If you don't feel, if you can't feel that, you know, if you don't feel like the story is, like you said, is you have a possibility of injecting anything yourself, then yeah, why would I want to play? You know, why do I want to be sitting at that table?
Yeah, but that's why I think most of the railroaded GMIs that players get to usually get done by accident. And I think most first time, second time, you're gonna do it by accident. It's just it just happens. You learn. Right. The only way you learn how to do things is by making mistakes and correcting it. So
yeah, and I think that's where I think that's, you know, one of those things, you know. I mean, this is a perfect example from what Kangster said. I just thought about it, but you know how he was saying that you could use things that the players did earlier in the game to help them out later with the GMI. So could you imagine rolling a 1? Let's say they're trying to pick a lock or something like that, and they roll a 1, and you tell them that their GMI is that, oh, you actually remember talking to, you know, this guy the other day, and he told you this one specific thing about this particular locking mechanism. You know, and they were like, oh, damn. So now it's easier for them to get the job done. But the complication would be that you set off an alarm. You know, I would do something like that. You know, and it just made me think about it. And that's what I'm saying. When we have these discussions, that's something else I try to encourage people to embrace with Cypher and the whole idea. When we have these discussions, we're learning stuff too. You know, let your mind expand, because if you open it, you're going to see a lot of different ways to apply a lot of the different mechanics that Cypher does offer. The few mechanics they offer are so easily applied in so many different ways.
Now, you want to read the next one?
Yep. Oh, wait, where did my notes go? There they go. Next one here is from Dalboni. Oh, that's their username on, what is it, YouTube. GM intrusion is optional. Players can actively judge about the future, and I assume what they mean by that is they can spend an XP to refute most GM intrusions. Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly valid. It's a great, I mean, we said it before, like, if the players really don't feel like it and they have the resources, they can just be like, no. We saw the example in the chat, someone talking about an actual play that someone just kept spending their XP until it was gone. But yeah, you know, and like, except for a case like that, yeah, you can definitely change the future with your XP spending just by saying, hey, I don't want that to happen.
That's the number one argument why it can't totally be railroading, because if you have an XP, you have the ability to cancel an intrusion if you wanted to. I'm not the rolling 1 intrusion, but the one that's being offered by the GM.
I mean, Godza just threw up a great one, and that's another one. And I was just saying how I say watching movies and TV shows, how you can see GM intrusions. Well, I was just watching a show called School Spirit, and guys was talking about the next GMI draw, miscellaneous. When texting calling, the PC accidentally communicates with the wrong person, and it's just
John's been posting GMI deck drawers the whole chat. I've
I
been
know.
reading
But
it.
and that
Cool.
particular one made me think about what I was saying when I made that
But that's
statement.
from the GMI deck.
Right, I understand that, but it made me think about the GMI I saw in a TV show called School Spirit. The girl, she gets killed and she becomes a ghost in the show, but her boyfriend sent the text message to the girl he was cheating on her with, and he had stolen her phone. So this became like a GMI, boom, right there. I'm like, oh, see, look here, just cool stuff that comes out when you can connect the dots.
The Bucks not esque quote. As written, no. I think it adds variety and it allows for interesting outcomes. It requires moderation and discretion on the part of the GM. However, overuse could lead to railroading, and that's the GM doing it wrong. I mean, we actually touched on this. Yep, if you overuse it, it could become not as impactful, and then everything becomes not as impactful every time you do use it. So yeah, totally agree with Edgar on this point. And I think most people that play Cypher regularly would say, nah, it's not railroading, it's just a tool. But I think that you get that the question has to be asked because Cypher's constantly getting new people coming in. And if you never played Cypher System before and you read this, you would think, oh, the GM could do whatever they want just by giving me an XP, and without realizing how important XP are to the mechanics of the Cypher System, and two, that it's not meant to be used as always negative.
Right. Our good friend Lucas Santana from what are those guys? What's that group? What's their group, Anthony?
They said you don't
Rule of Lore.
Rule of Lore.
Rule of Lore, but the show is Ramblemancy. Yeah.
Yeah, Rule of Lore, Ramblemancy. But Lucas says, oh boy, do I have opinions about what things are considered railroading in tabletop RPGs. They boil down to this. Railroading is removing agency and thwarting players' choices for the sake of the story the GM wants to tell. It's when players' choices don't matter. Intrusions are all about players' choices. The choice to take the intrusion or not, the choice of what to do after the intrusion happens, etc. So I think that's a great way of looking at it. I like that.
Yeah, if you haven't, please go check out Rule of Law on Twitch. They do a phenomenal show. They do actual plays. They have a show similar to ours called Ramblemancy. Yeah, check out Rule of Law. They do fantastic work, and they're really good friends of ours. But to go to the statement, I agree with everything essentially what they're saying, but I'm not so much sure that railroading is removing agency and thwarting players' choices for the sake of the story. I think it's removing agency because me and Dean always have the discussion. The GM's job is to control the story and move the story forward. So I'm always leery when the expression is, you taking my agency away. But what's more important, a player's agency or a cohesive story? And I will argue that a cohesive story is more important than a player's agency. Maybe it's the phrasing is worded, but yeah.
Here's and I'm gonna jump right on the bandwagon with you because I do agree. But here's another thing we have to think about. If you are running a pre-written adventure, if you are running a one-shot, you are truly. Everybody should be understanding that they're on the same path anyway. It's a story. We want to get from the beginning of this story to the end of that story. Versus where you have a campaign. Even in a campaign, there's a massive story. There's a meta story, a meta plot that has to be educated. But players then you do have much more because you have an entire world to make choices in. And as a GM, you have to be able to recognize those two sides of that coin as well. So that's all I want to throw out there.
Al, you want to read that guy's quote?
Yeah, I was just gonna lead into that once
That
y'all
guy,
wrapped
oh
up.
god, it's that guy again. Hell.
But our last two comments here on the poll were from our good buddy Kedhup, that guy, as they're referring to him as. But the first comment says, not at all. GMs grant players a choice. It's something that other systems are missing that can cause railroading. The choice in Cypher is what makes it so the GM can F around with the players without it feeling cheaty, because the players still have the option to say no at a cost. Players have nothing more than to simply be told this is how it is. If you give them a choice or even the slimmest of chances on something like 1%, they're almost always fine with the consequences and it doesn't feel like a railroad at all, which is very valid. And his second follow-up, I would like to add that there is a wrong use case for GMIs that make it feel railroady, and that's when a GM uses a GMI to negate a success, which is completely counter to what the rule tells you it's for. A GMI should never negate a success. It is only there to add drama or something interesting. I mean, we've been making that point the whole show, like, if you're just there to, like, with Dean's example of the device they created or whatever, if you use your GMI to just say, hey, that doesn't work, or hey, your well thought out plan just doesn't work, it's kind of like a big FU to the players. Like, that is definitely not a good GMI. So yeah, very, very valid points there, Cut Up.
And I'm
going up as usual, dropping jewels.
and and that's a big thing that I think we as GMs, as well as players, need to kind of embrace, but especially GMs. Think about it for a minute. If it may not be the solution you initially came up with for the story, but the players don't know it. And if the players do something cool, do not make the players, put in, 6 months of work to come up with a cool idea, and then you just shit all over it by doing, throwing a GMI or that just didn't work. You can adjust your story. I mean, especially if it makes sense. If what they're doing is sensible, I would say, remember those things, and like Kenneth said, don't make it counterintuitive to what's going on in the game.
Before we leave off, Billy Loser asked one last question, and I think it's a good question to ask. Do you think overusing GMIs could be used for a good purpose?
The word overusing, no. If it's being overused, it's not gonna. I can't foresee a good purpose to abuse this particular mechanic.
I can think of one. Horror mode overuses GMIs.
Well, with horror mode, that's dice rolling as opposed to introduced GMIs where the GM is just like, hey, here's a GMI. I think he's more referring to that case where it's like, hey, here's a GMI, here's a GMI, here's a GMI, here's a not horror mode dice rolls.
I mean, I do agree that there comes a point in time, if there's too many GMIs, right, then you're essentially controlling all the action. It's like watching a film or reading a book that every page jumps to a different scene. It's just not going to be a good read. It's not going to be a good watch. You know what I mean?
If you really think about it, it literally cheapens what a GMI stands for.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it, it doesn't become impact. It's not impactful if you're just using them willy-nilly.
Even horror mode gets a little ridiculous once you start.
Horror mode can be horror mode might be the only place I would think to kind of have a list of GMI set up, based on the horror game itself. But I think about most horror movies. Near the end, it gets ridiculous.
Like, it gets kind of wonky when you start. Yeah. I mean, realistically, let's keep it real. Once you start hitting horror at 8 or 9, like
it becomes.
You start running out of interesting things. Then you could get 3 GMIs in one scene, and you start running out of interesting things to add into the story.
That's why I said I would probably have think about it this way. If we want to take an example of horror mode, let's look at the first. Let's look at Aliens with the second Alien movie.
example. I know how it works. I'm
No, I'm
stating
not
that.
saying you don't know how to run it. I'm not saying it that way. The reason why I brought it up though is saying that in that place, I could see, horror mode. But if you look at it, there was a series of things that were in place. They had them creeping through the roof. They fell down. They found the queen. But these seem like they could have been pre-planned out. So what I'm saying is, when I go into horror mode, I'm probably going to start trying to have a list of things that I can pull from to make it more impactful in those scenes. Oh, your foot gets caught. Oh, you trip. There's stuff like that is what I'm saying.
I don't think that was the point. The point I was trying to make is that even horror mode, like, just to go back to the initial question, right, about overuse, right? Even horror mode, and I was the one that mentioned horror mode, funny enough, though, could get breaks down at 8 or 9, because when you have 5 players and you get an intrusion between a 1 and a 9, chances are every scene, like, there's a high probability, almost a 50-50 chance that everyone that's rolling is going to get a GM intrusion in a particular scene. And it breaks down. It doesn't become a cohesive story then when if you have 4 players and 3 of them are getting an intrusion every turn.
Again, like I said, and that's why I get what you're saying. That's why I said I would probably have something planned out for that, because it is horror mode. It is
And I understand that. I'm saying even with the pre-plan, it's still gonna get wonky. Even with the pre-plan. Yeah, like Eric was saying, you could reset horror mode because I think once it gets too high, it becomes a little bit ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
But with that said, we just start off like we always do. But then again, too, just to hit that back, it's not often that you're going to get to 8 or 9. It's usually at the end of the session. But when it does come up, it does get a little long.
You remember you can always set your GMI limit too.
Yep.
You do. So remember that you can always set that. Like in horror mode, you can set the horror mode limit. You can say, horror mode cuts off at 5 or it cuts off at 8. I think Eric was saying about having it reset. So if it reaches 9, guess what? Okay, now it shifts back. It's back to 1. And it cycles around. So there are ways to contend with those situations. And we're just talking about it, but I think as a whole, I really enjoyed our conversation tonight. I got to say thank you to the chat because you guys were on fire. Lots of gems thrown our way. You kept the discussion going, and you really, really, engaged us and gave us some stuff to think about. I mean, I can't really speak for these guys, but I think I can and say you gave us some stuff to think about. You've even expanded our horizons, and we call ourselves, Cypher System aficionado experts, if you want, and we're always learning stuff, because we're not experts. We're just guys who love the game. So, thanks a lot, guys. Anthony, Al, you want to say goodnight to the people?
I'll hop right into our spiel. If you like us and you like what we do, join the Cypher Unlimited Discord server for all things Monty Cook games. We have the largest fan-run server for everything MCG, games being played, the great discussions being had, and even polls and questions like are GM Intrusions railroading the players there. If you want to support us in any way, give us a subscription here on Twitch, or better yet, go to our YouTube channel and like, share, and subscribe there. Both platforms we're trying to grow, so we'll greatly appreciate it if you support us on either. Our videos are always free, but if you want to support us in a little way, give us a little donation on Ko-fi. It helps us out with setting up CypherCon and little things like giveaways and stuff that we plan for the future. Or go to our online store and pick up some cool Cypher Unlimited merch, like the hat I got on that wonderful CypherCon. I never saw that shirt that Dean has on. I love that color, the CypherCon shirt that Dean has on. And last but not least, we love you guys.
And real quick, just so you know, if you want a CypherCon shirt, you have until the 31st of December to purchase one, because these shirts will be going the way of the dodo bird. as of the 1st of January. So just so everybody knows, these CypherCon shirts, these are exclusives for CypherCon 1. There will be new shirts for CypherCon 2.
Great little addendum there, because yeah, we will be taking them down, so grab them while you can. My husband did a great job on that art, and I did a silly job, but I still like it. But either way, thank you everybody for coming by. This was an excellent chat. We got some great perspectives, and hopefully everyone participating in the chat and listening on YouTube gained some great perspective from this as well. Because that's why we do this, to help, broaden people's horizons. And with that being said, thank you again.
Before we say, are we streaming next week?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe we do something Thursday, on the channel or something. I don't know.
No, just like this one. This is the Thursday before Christmas. So next week will be the Thursday before New Year's. Unless New Year's. So you guys, I mean,
your two might, because I think I'm traveling to Maryland to visit the in-laws for New Year's, so I might not be around.
We'll figure it out in either case.
And we'll let everybody know.
Yep.
With that being said, in case we do not stream next week, have a great New Year. And have a great holiday for this weekend. Whether you celebrate or not, you should still have a great weekend. And yeah, thank you again so much, everybody, for stopping by. Thank you guys. We love you guys. And yeah, from us at the CU, we will see you later.
Bye, guys.